Welcome to Cross-Border Tax Talks, where we discuss the latest trends in international taxation, from U.S. tax reform to the latest on customs and trade. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. PwC's Pillar 2 engine, powered by Beacon, is a game changer for Pillar 2 modeling, provision, and compliance calculations. Built on a graph system utilizing over 20 years of international tax technology, this cloud-based centralized rules engine is developed by a team of Pillar 2 tax experts from around the globe. PwC's Pillar 2 engine is currently available as a service and is now available to license. On this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks, we're back at PwC's International Tax Conference in Dana Point, California, where I'm excited to welcome Kristin Bohl to the podcast. Kristin is a Chicago-based partner in PwC's Custom and International Trade practice. Prior to joining PwC, Kristin served as a judicial law clerk at the U.S. Court of International Trade. Kristin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Doug. I'm very happy to be here.
So it has been a whipsaw of a couple of days, and I am going to give a caveat to listeners before we get going. So I wanted to note that we're recording this on March 4th, less than 24 hours after the Trump administration imposed 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, as well as additional 10% tariffs on imports from China. And recording this, I think, approximately 3 hours since Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said that President Trump will probably announce that there's a tariff compromise deal with Canada and Mexico tomorrow.
That's right.
So suffice it to say, this is a very dynamic environment. We're going to try to stay away from some of the specifics because they will be outdated before we can even get this thing published.
That's right. Yep. Very fluid.
You are in high demand. So I want to start. I usually start these podcasts with an icebreaker, and I try to avoid doing sort of technical concepts as part of the icebreaker. But my mother-in-law recently had a question, and she's not a lawyer. She doesn't do tax or trade or anything else. But she was asking me about these reciprocal tariffs. And so occasionally my mother-in-law and certainly my mom listens to these podcasts. So for my mom and my mother-in-law, Kristin, can you explain what is a tariff? Why do countries impose tariffs?
Yes, I can. I've gotten the same question from my mother and my mother-in-law, so hopefully they'll listen
And they don't do customs and trade,
They don't
I'm
do
guessing.
customs and trade,
All right.
no. So very simply, a tariff is a tax imposed by a government on an import or an export. And historically, why governments impose these tariffs is one of kind of three basic reasons. They're either seeking to protect domestic industries, they might be seeking to raise revenues, or they might be seeking to address a trade imbalance that they have with another country. So there's lots of different ways tariffs are wielded, but those are kind of the three primary reasons why governments impose them.
Great answer. All right. Mom, you can tune out now because we're going to get into some of the specifics. So I thought we would start with the Trump administration executive orders and actions. And I've been covering a lot of the tax aspects and particularly some of the discriminatory tax issues, particularly around Pillar 2. But I'm excited to have you on to sort of unpack some of this trade and tariff stuff. So I think the first major Trump administrative executive order was related to the America First trade policy. So what is that, Kristin?
The America First trade policy, Doug, I think about it as the umbrella that covers sort of all the tariff actions that the administration is taking right now. The America First trade policy was announced on Inauguration Day. The primary focus of that policy is to address unfair and unbalanced trade. And there are lots of different moving parts within that America First trade policy, some of which are represented by the various executive orders that we see coming down from Mexico, Canada, and China. Some of it relates to investigations that are ongoing right now at the behest of the administration for various government agencies to investigate things like trade deficits, investigate things like unfair trade practices, and also to take a deeper dive and really a wholesale review of all of the free trade agreements to which the U.S. is currently a party, asking the question of, are these still fit for purpose? Do these still serve American economic needs? So the America First trade policy is really this umbrella policy that kind of covers all manner of tariff actions that the administration is taking right now.
Yeah, and for the tax practitioners are listening, the way I kind of think about it is we got an executive order from the Trump administration related to an investigation for taxes to try to identify potentially discriminatory and or extraterritorial taxes with the potential imposition of Section 891, which we've talked about in prior podcasts, where the Treasury Department is going to look to identify which of those taxes. And I feel like this is kind of the tariff equivalent of what we've seen from a tax perspective. Is that
I think that's right. I think that's fair. I do think it's interesting because the America First trade policy, along with some of the corresponding investigations that it covers, and also I'm sure we'll talk about the reciprocal tariffs announcement as well, but they are first and foremost tax, trade, tariff policy, but they're really evidence, Doug, of the administration using trade policy as a means to achieve foreign policy outcomes, right? Which that's kind of unique, right? It's a different way than administrations have used tariff policy in the past, but it definitely shows the breadth with which this administration is looking to apply these.
And we're going to unpack that on this podcast, and because there are also, I'll get a lot of questions, particularly from people outside the U.S. that try to understand what the president can or cannot do, and I think we'll unpack that as we talk about Canada and Mexico. But before we do that, you had already teased this. There was an announcement on an investigation with respect to reciprocal tariffs. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. That investigation came in mid-February. The announcement came in mid-February. And really what the administration, to put it in straightforward terms, they're looking at the tariffs that other countries apply to American exports. And their theory is if they apply a tariff or a duty to American exports that's higher than the duty we apply when we import the same products from them, we're looking to equalize it, right? We're looking to create reciprocal tariffs. Now, what's really interesting about that, though, Doug, is that the administration is looking far beyond just duties and tariffs. When they look at reciprocity, they're including things like VAT, which every country virtually in the world has except for the U.S.
Is a VAT a tariff?
No, a VAT is not a tariff, right? And they are also looking at things like non-tariff barriers, which, just for those in the listening who might not know what that means, those are things like regulations around sanitary requirements, or can the beef that we import into the EU have hormones in it, right? Those are non-tariff barriers. Very difficult to quantify those, right? How do you assess how much of a duty that represents? And so part of the balance that the administration is trying to strike is looking at those various additional, let's just say, tariffs and quotes. How do we equalize that amongst our countries? Yeah,
I mean, and this is so analogous to, from a tax perspective, because they talk about extraterritorial and discriminatory taxes. We know that Pillar 2 is sort of in the crosshairs from a tax perspective, but there's also digital service taxes. There are a number of other sort of taxes that, arguably could be considered extraterritorial. It's going to be very interesting to see how the executive branch, kind of what those lists look like, both from a tariff perspective and from a tax perspective. And I think we have no idea.
No, but what I will say is that just because you mentioned digital services taxes, that's also in the crosshairs from a tariff perspective, right? So, VAT's out there, and if you just think about other areas that the administration is trying to reach with tariffs, DSTs is on the list as well. If Canada, for example, who announced DSTs not too long ago, the U.S. has already initiated discussions with them under the USMCA to investigate those DSTs. And the result of that investigation may be tariffs on Canada, right? So the administration is using tariffs to address all sorts of discriminatory taxes.
Yeah, and I think the important piece for listeners, well, there's a lot of important pieces, but an important piece for listeners is that they have a number of different weapons. Maybe that's not the right word, but tools. How about tools that they can use as countermeasures? One is the Section 891, which is potentially increasing taxes on non-residents and foreign corporations, which again we've talked about. But then tariffs are sort of another tool in their toolbox to fight against this. And I think it's interesting that they are kind of arming both. And we don't know. Will they use 891? Will they use tariffs? I don't know. So let's talk about some of the examples. And again, again, some of this can get outdated very quickly, but I think sort of what we've seen to date hopefully provides some context for listeners as to how the administration is thinking about this. And I want to start with one that was just in the news for a very short amount of time, right after President Trump took office, and that was Colombia. I think most people assume we'd start with Canada and Mexico, right. But tariffs were in the news with Colombia. Tell us about that. What happened there?
Yeah. Colombia was just a nice Sunday afternoon idea, I think, that the administration had that, as you said, was...
Literally, it was a weekend, I think, right?
It was on a Sunday. Okay. And it's a great example of, number one, just how fluid and dynamic this area is. We saw an announcement of tariffs being threatened to be imposed on Colombia in response to Colombia's initial refusal to accept deportation, right, planes, letting them land in Colombia. So it's an example of, A, just how fluid it is. They were announced in the morning. They were pulled back in the afternoon. And it is also an example of the administration using trade policy to achieve non-trade outcomes. Yeah. But again, that was sort of a flash in the pan. That started in the morning, ended in the afternoon, and by Tuesday it was old news.
Right. I mean, it was, but that was, I viewed that as kind of a sign of potential things to come. Yep. So let's move to Canada and Mexico, and maybe help listeners understand, first of all, the authority that President Trump had, because I've received a number of questions like, you know, Trump wants to start a trade war, you know, but why, what does this have to do with fentanyl?
Right.
You know, and what does trade and tariffs have to do with fentanyl? And obviously it has to do with the powers that Congress has given him, but help explain that.
Sure. I think the interesting thing to note with respect to the Canada, Mexico, and also the China orders that were just put in place is that the authority that they rested on was under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, or we call IEEPA.
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 Everybody needs a good.
Everybody needs to say IEEPA.
All right, I kind of like to say that.
And I think for starters, it's important to contextualize these tariffs because when they are promulgated in the context of an emergency, in theory, that emergency can be addressed, right? There's an expectation of a response on the part of Canada and Mexico when it comes to border issues, on the part of all three countries when it comes to their contributions to fentanyl crossing the border. And should that emergency be addressed, then shouldn't we expect that those tariffs to be withdrawn, right? So I think it's important to understand the authority used to promulgate the tariffs because it tells us a lot about the potential duration, right? So as we think about Canada, we think about Mexico, yes, the tariffs may have nothing to do with fentanyl, but again, we're using trade policy to get those countries to do what we want them to do. And in theory, when they do that thing, then those tariffs will be pulled back. And as you noted at the top, Lutnick is out there already today saying it's possible that we may reach a deal with Canada and Mexico as early as tomorrow.
Right, and even though this may be out of date by the time this thing gets published, what were those tariffs? I think it was 25%?
That's correct. It's 25% on all country of origin goods coming from Canada and Mexico, and it is an additional 10% on all goods coming from China, which is noteworthy because the administration had already passed 10% tariffs on Chinese goods in February. So we have a 20%.
Additional 10%, right? Because there were some historic ones.
Exactly. That was on top of the tariffs that the first Trump administration had imposed, which really ranged anywhere between 7.5% to 25%. The Biden administration then doubled down and added on top of that. So with today's current state, and of course this is fluid, but today's current state, tariffs on Chinese goods are ranging anywhere between 20% to 70%, depending on the products we're talking about.
So one of the challenges, and we're going to talk about some of the industries, and particularly automotive has certainly, because given how integrated supply chains are for the big automotive companies between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, one of the fascinating things that I read is the number of times various components and pieces cross borders as they're putting together a car, right? Because the stereo turbo and the engine and the seats. These can all be made in different places and they cross borders multiple times. How does that work when products and components cross borders multiple times? Is there one tariff on the end? Now, this is a loaded question, but like maybe explain how that works when you have multiple components crossing borders multiple times.
Right. So in the automotive industry, as an example, as you said, on average, a car may cross back and forth across a North American border about 8 times. And in today's environment, that is okay. It's doable because we've got USMCA, right? The US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. And most automotive supply chains are built around sustaining USMCA compliant movements. Well, the thing about these 25% tariffs with Canada and Mexico is that they render USMCA, for purposes of the tariff, useless. So now we have this movement coming back and forth, potentially up to 8 times for a vehicle, and every single border crossing presents its own tariff event. Mm-hmm. And the good news for companies is that there are strategies out there to think about to lessen the blow of that movement and the tariff impact. But for companies that don't have to be doing that today, it's a whole new ball of wax. It's a whole new thing to consider from an implementation perspective, from a compliance perspective, because at the end of the day, they're trying to pay less in tariffs, and the government doesn't want that, right? So they're up against the machine of tariffs, and they're trying to figure out how do we lessen the impact on our companies. And so, they're at loggerheads. And so it's very complex for companies right now. It's injecting, in most cases, we just say, it's injecting 25% cost into their supply chain. But for certain supply chains, it's way more than 25% cost because they're crossing the border so many times.
So you had mentioned the emergency IEEPA? IEEPA. All right. What other authority, and then I want to talk about some of the tariffs on steel and aluminum, because we've covered China, Canada, Mexico, but to provide additional context, what other powers does the executive branch have to administer tariffs? And then also, like, when does Congress potentially need to get involved?
Yes. So I'll keep it simple.
Yeah, that could be a whole separate podcast.
I won't use code references. But
Thank you.
On the one hand, you've got executive powers that require the president to first take some sort of executive investigatory action. So he works with the Department of Commerce or the U.S. Trade Representative or the International Trade Commission to perform an investigation that says, these, imports are harming domestic industry, or these are unfair trade practices. And so you can think about that bucket of authority as a little bit more restrained, because there has to be some investigation that happens before you can take action on tariffs.
Okay.
We've seen that before. That's steel and aluminum in the past based on national security. That's all the China tariffs that came in the first administration. The other bucket to be aware of are the more emergency style powers, one of which we've talked about, which is IEEPA. Other ones are meant to address things like trade deficits, which grant the president sole discretion to impose up to 15% tariffs, once a trade deficit is identified, and other emergency measures that are meant to address economic disparity. Right? So think about things like reciprocal tariffs, right? So I would categorize the authority that the president has in these two buckets, one of which is very much within his sole discretion, the other one which requires a little bit of legwork on the part of administrative agencies. If we just step away then from pure executive authority, of course we all know that really the power to create tariffs and to legislate duties, that rests with Congress.
Right.
And so you've seen over the course of a little bit leading up to inauguration and after, there has been some proposals coming out of Congress to address tariff actions. There was a bill introduced prior to the holidays where, they were trying to remove permanent normal trade relations from China. Basically start treating China like we treat North Korea and like how we treat Iran. So I think Congress is trying to wade into the waters a little bit, but this administration is being very forceful in how it is approaching tariff policy. So at some point, I do think the administration, when it looks for something to be a bit more long-term, it's very possible it might let Congress step in there, because Congress's authority to legislate on tariffs is quite firm and quite well understood.
Right.
When you're doing it as the sole discretion of the president under an emergency powers, that is potentially subject to much more challenge.
Yeah, and this has been very confusing, understandably, for some of our non-U.S. listeners, because if you go back to the beginning of the Biden administration, when the Biden administration was negotiating Pillar 2 with the OECD, and they had committed to change our guilty regime to by country, and that was supposed to be in compliance with Pillar 2. And then that didn't happen because Congress couldn't get the Build Back Better Act through. And I think many of us U.S. advisors were running around the world saying, well, Congress in the U.S. is the one that enacts the laws. Right? And it's just like, well, we've got our 3 branches of government, and we go through a whole civics lesson, and it's just like, well, Congress is the one that enacts the laws. And now all of a sudden all this tariff stuff comes in, and they're like, I thought that Congress, and sorry, like every good law, there's an exception. And what Congress did is they had delegated to the president, as you wonderfully articulated, in certain matters that the president, because they were granted the power from Congress, can initiate these tariffs. Congress has not granted the power, and I think the Congress has not granted the power to the executive branch. I think there would be constitutional issues for tax writing authority. That's specifically in the Constitution. And so I do have some sympathy for our non-U.S. colleagues trying to understand what is going on in the U.S. with our legislative and executive branches.
Absolutely. It's very confusing. One thing I will say is that the level of executive action taken as it relates to trade and tariff policy in this administration is unprecedented.
Yeah, fair point, because these have been around for decades, right? That this legislative authority was granted decades ago.
Yes, the basis for the China tariffs comes from a trade act that's been in place since 1974. Okay. So yes, the powers have been there sort of lying dormant for many, many years, but this is really an unprecedented level of activity and action by the executive in this area.
Okay, so let's move on then to the steel and aluminum tariff. So it's a little different than what we were talking about, Canada, Mexico, and China. What are the steel and aluminum tariffs?
So the steel and aluminum tariffs were actually a vestige of the first Trump administration. So the Trump administration, round 1, used their authority under the national security investigation to determine that imports of steel and aluminum were a threat to our national security, right? Basically, should we be in a situation of war, we weren't sure that we had the domestic capacity to produce as needed to support our efforts. So those started in 2018. What happened throughout the course of that first Trump administration was a series of different types of relief from those tariffs. Those came in the form of things like quotas, which said, well, you can bring a certain amount of steel or aluminum into the U.S. duty-free, but once it hits this amount, then we'll hit you with the tariffs. We also granted exceptions for certain countries, Canada and Mexico among them, right? We said, okay, for your steel and aluminum, we're not going to apply the tariffs. So out of that process came a steel and aluminum tariff policy with a lot of holes in it, a lot of gaps. And I think what the administration, round 2, is looking at is starting fresh again and saying, hold on, all that relief, all that exception and exemption that we created in the steel and aluminum landscape, we don't want to keep that going forward. And so basically what these new orders did was first and foremost reestablish kind of no exceptions, right? Tariffs on steel and aluminum. It raised the tariff on aluminum from 10% to 25%. So now both steel and aluminum are coming in at 25%. It also extended the products covered by the orders. And not to get too technical, but your basic steel and aluminum raw products, those have always been covered. And to some extent, steel and aluminum derivative products, meaning products that incorporate steel and aluminum. Okay. Those were included before. But this time around, they went further, and they included many, many more steel and aluminum products. And so it's an expansion, but more than anything, it's almost getting back to neutral of what they had done in the previous administration. But interestingly enough, similar to the Canada, Mexico, and China tariffs that we've just talked about, steel and aluminum are exempt from eligibility for strategies like duty drawback, which is very important for companies out there to know, because that's one of the primary tools companies used in the first administration to blunt the force of the tariffs. That is not available for steel and aluminum.
And what is duty drawback?
Great question. Duty drawback
Teed me up.
is a strategy that allows an importer, when they pay duties on imported goods, they can claim a refund of up to 99% of those duties paid if they subsequently re-export that product or a further manufactured product. Incredibly impactful for companies that have a supply chain that meets those requirements. Yeah. But again, the administration really took away that tool when it promulgated the steel and aluminum tariffs and under these new IEEPA tariffs.
All right. So what about the rest of the world? Because we've got a lot of listeners that are outside Canada, that are outside North America and China. What about the rest of the world, whether it's Europe or other places in Asia, should companies be focusing on or thinking about?
Sure. Two comments on that. The first is that the administration has been very vocal about looking to apply tariffs to the EU first and foremost. Some in the administration have referred to the EU as a mini China, which tells you how some of the administration feels about the EU. They are also heavily focused on Asia because as companies look to potentially exit China, and as the Chinese government looks to strategize on what their tariff response is going to be, you see an extension of Chinese investment to other countries, right? Building plants, investing in ports, engaging in shipbuilding in other countries. And so the administration is very weary about the long arm of China investment in other, particularly Southeast Asian countries. So that's one thing, right? I think EU and Asia need to be on alert that the administration has those areas in their sights. To compound that, we've already talked about how the America First trade policy is first and foremost focused on trade deficits and unfair trade practices. If you look at trade deficits, many EU countries and many countries in Southeast Asia are very high on the list of countries with whom the U.S. has a trade deficit. Right. So if you think strategically about where the U.S. administration is going to look first, it's going to be those countries with whom we have that significant deficit, and EU and Southeast Asia are right in the crosshairs.
Got it. All right, so I want to shift now to some specific industries and sectors. And we touched on automotive, we'll come back, but I think there's been a number really kind of pharmaceutical, automotive, and then the technology industry. And I say pharmaceutical, it's broader than that, more life sciences, medical technology. But what should those, for example, in that medtech, life sciences, pharmaceutical space be thinking about?
So very specific to the pharmaceuticals, life science, medtech space is the fact that that is an industry that has largely enjoyed many of their products moving duty-free across borders since time immemorial. So it's not true for every product, but for example, finished pharmaceutical goods, drugs, historically they cross into the U.S. duty-free. So
and that's a policy decision because it's for life-saving activities.
Exactly. We like to see life-saving drugs come into our country without barriers, right? But the challenge there is that many companies in that space have never had to build the know-how and the strategy around managing things like duties and tariffs. And so as we approach this new horizon of, the administration calling pharmaceutical company, industry out specifically, that's not a muscle they know how to flex. And so they're positioned slightly differently than, say, the automotive industry, which has historically been, very focused on managing duty spend and managing things like tariffs. So, I think the pharmaceutical industry stands a little bit on its own in this regard because this is a new this is a new area of focus for them that they haven't had to deal with before.
And I've spent a lot of time in my career in the retail and consumer market sector. They've got big teams, right? Though they just like automotive.
Yes.
I mean, listen, none of the companies want additional tariffs, but the fact is that they have teams and they're just used to having to deal with this.
No question. I mean, you think about the retail space, goods like apparel and footwear, for example, historically some of the highest duties into the U.S. going back decades.
Yeah.
We're talking about average duty rates of 17 to 34%. So these are companies that they've coordinated on trade mitigation strategies since the birth of their companies. And so, again, this is a muscle they know how to flex. And that's very different than pharmaceutical and life sciences, which are coming at this fresh.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point and really a change management and operational exercise as much as it is
Absolutely.
a cost.
And just to put some numbers to that, Doug, the pharmaceutical industry today on an annual basis into the U.S. pays about $87 million in tariffs.
With an M.
An M.
It's a big industry. That's a small number. Just
That's
for
a
those.
very small number. If all of the proposed tariff policies go forward, we're going to see potentially that 87 million jump to over 50 billion.
With a B.
With a B.
Yeah.
Right? So that delta tells you a lot about the impact of that industry. By comparison, automotive today pays about 3.5 billion in tariffs. Theirs could jump to 60 billion. So I'm not trying to minimize that. It's still a big number, but just by comparison.
That's a multiple, not exponential.
Exactly. So that tells you a little bit about the industry impact and the lens that some of these companies need to be looking at this through.
So what about technology companies?
Technology companies are squarely within the crosshairs. And if you think about U.S. policy starting with the Biden administration, there is a strong interest in promoting domestic manufacturing and domestic technology in this sector, whether it's semiconductors or other electronics. That is a huge focus for the U.S. administrations. Currently today, that industry pays about $1.6 billion in tariffs. That could go up to $17 billion in tariffs.
Okay.
So again, we're talking billions, so I don't want to minimize and say that's not big. But again, by comparison, very different. And that is an industry that, to some extent, has the tariff mitigation muscle to flex. But for example, semiconductors, historically duty-free, but they have been dealing with tariffs since Trump administration #1. So they have a little bit of practice now going into Trump administration #2. Again, it just tells you a little bit about the different starting points for each of these industries to respond.
Yeah, some fascinating data for sure. Thanks for bringing that. I now want to shift over to, well, what can we expect? What can we expect? How other countries might react and retaliatory measures. Maybe we'll start with Canada and Mexico. And again, this will probably be outdated, but I think it's still a good lens into how countries, and we also, saw this during Trump 1.0 before 2.0, but maybe talk about some of the targeted and strategic approaches. I find it very interesting how countries, when they're doing retaliatory measures, pick certain items from certain states, for example, of what they're going to tariff.
No question. So I do think Canada, Mexico, and China are all very good barometers of what we can expect potentially from an EU or other Southeast Asian countries. Because of the tariffs that the administration has imposed, all three countries have either already retaliated or have made very plain that they will intend to retaliate. And to your point, their retaliatory measures are very targeted. So China, for example, almost exclusively hitting the U.S. ag sector, right? All of the U.S. exports of, agricultural goods like produce and farm animals and things like chicken, et cetera, those are all getting hit by the China tariffs. Canada is a little bit broader, definitely hitting ag, but also hitting lots of consumer products, lots of consumer electronics, cosmetics industry, things like that. Interesting that you brought up targeting states, right? Because there has absolutely been pointed remarks by these other countries to say they are looking to hit industries in specifically certain political parties, right? Because they believe they know who is behind the U.S. tariffs and who's promoting those tariffs, and so they're trying to hit U.S. where it hurts. How targeted they can truly be there, is a little bit of a difficult math game, but I think they are all a very good bellwether for the fact that our trading partners are not going to take this without a response. Will it be a response in kind? That's a great question. So far, Canada has said 25%, right? But I do think we're expecting Mexico very soon to announce its retaliatory measures. We'll see what President Sheinbaum puts out there as far as a rate. I think there is, even though these countries are trying to come out very forcefully with a retaliatory measure, I do think we are also still seeing them all really, really want the U.S. to back off. Something to bear in mind, and again, being mindful that this could change here in a couple of days, but as soon as Canada announced its retaliatory measures today, the Trump administration came right back and said, whatever Canada retaliates with, that just gets added to our reciprocal tariff.
Yeah, and just one point that you made, like with China and the ag, I mean, just to make sure that particularly for our non-U.S. listeners, they're focusing on the red states. Like,
Correct.
in other words, those states that voted for Trump and I think the strategy, and some have articulated, is, they want to put the hurt on those voters that voted for Trump to potentially, change their minds. As we think about, every 2 years, the House of Representatives turns over a certain number from the Senate. And so that appears to be the strategy. And again, this is not a new strategy.
Right.
We've seen this in the past. Maybe the last thing on the retaliatory measures is Europe and EU. And do you have any insight specifically with respect to sort of the EU acting as a bloc, and then various targeted measures or various targeted things from certain countries in the EU?
So I do think that from a retaliatory perspective, it is highly likely that the EU will respond as a bloc. As a customs union, they are fortified in that sense. Interestingly, though, Doug, as I mentioned before, the countries with whom the U.S. has a significant trade deficit, many of those are EU countries. Italy, Switzerland's not EU, of course, but Germany. There are France, for example. These are all countries that we have a truly significant trade deficit. So can the U.S. be particularly targeted in how we manage our tariffs applied to just French products or just Italian products? Yes, we certainly can. And so the question you asked around, will they respond as a bloc? I think the EU largely right now, for reasons beyond tariffs, is coalescing in a way that is in some part a response to U.S. policies outside of trade and tariffs, right? So I do expect the EU to continue to coalesce across multiple areas like foreign policy, but on a trade policy response as well.
We shall see.
Yes.
So let's move now to sort of here at the end is like, what can companies do? And I'll just share some experiences again from particularly working in consumer markets and the retail sector. That moving manufacturing plants takes a lot of time, right? And I think that the Trump administration is very focused. They know they have this 2-year window, right, where the Republicans control both chambers of Congress. And so as we think about what companies can do, and we've already seen a whole number of investments from a whole number of both Taiwan multinational, U.S. multinationals that are announcing major investments in the U.S., those will take years and years and years to happen. So trying to rebuild the manufacturing plan in the next 2 years or 4 years, frankly, is really not realistic. Now, to the point that you made earlier, identifying alternative supply chain, we're using contract manufacturers, for example, certainly creates some opportunity. But what can and should companies be doing to react to this and to try to mitigate the potential downside of these additional tariffs?
I think it's important for companies to think about their strategic responses on a little bit of a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you make an absolutely great point around the fact that changing your footprint or your sourcing strategy, investing in new manufacturing locations is a long-term and, let's not forget, very costly strategy. And it really disrupts things like your tax operating model and your income tax strategy overall. So that's what I would put on the long-term end of the spectrum. Most companies right now are focused on short-term and mid-term solutions. And that's really a combination of pure customs strategies that I think of as really no regrets planning, because you can wind that strategy up to be responsive to the tariffs in a relatively short period of time, like we're talking a matter of weeks or a few months. And then to the extent we see a rollback of some of these tariffs, you can roll back that strategy too, right? So it's no regrets. You're not going to put in place a structure that costs you a ton of money and then suddenly you're stuck with when the tariffs go away. Those are strategies like for sale for export. For older tariffs, it was duty drawback. It's also things like foreign trade zones, which allow companies to, defer the payment of tariffs. So those are really short-term, no regrets things that companies can do. In the short/midterm, there's also really a role for the tax department to think about how they can be involved in the planning. And I've spoken to dozens and dozens of companies at the tax folks at those companies. And on the one hand, many tax folks don't want to touch tariffs with a 10-foot pole. And
I used to be one of those, but here I am.
And listen, it makes sense. It doesn't roll up to them.
Yeah.
It's not something they're responsible for or measured on. And so it makes sense that they don't want to maybe be tip of the spear on some of these strategies. But if the strategies involve things like tweaking our transfer pricing strategy, unbundling things so that we can lower the basis of tariffs, or looking at how we're embedding royalties or other charges into our transfer price, or maybe slightly bigger things like shifts in our tax operating model, you want a seat at the table. If you are a tax person at that company, you don't want those decisions being made and then finding out about them and how they're going to impact your tax strategy on the back end. You want to be at the table, having that discussion, guiding the path so that you don't pull one customs lever and trip something up on the tax side. So if every company that I talk to where, of course, I understand the resistance of the tax teams to kind of dive in head first here, my advice is always, you don't have to be tip of the spear, but you have to be at the table.
Yeah. It's great advice. And I mean, it's something that we're seeing, across tax now, like the importance for tax departments to work with the Customs and Trade team. What we're seeing in Pillar 2, where it's this whole new system of tax that requires all this data and working with accounting and finance. It really requires now tax teams to integrate with all aspects of the business. And this is just another example of why that's so important.
Absolutely.
So this was fantastic. You really helped kind of unpack some of these complexities. We'll see what continues to happen. It's been a little over, less than 2 months, right? A month and a half. Been very dynamic. I'm speculating it's going to continue to be that dynamic, and I look forward to you coming back and we can chat more about it as we have more developments. So,
I look forward to it as well.
So thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Doug.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks. Thank you, Kristin Bohl, a partner in PwC's Custom and International Trade Practice. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. Stay tuned for another exciting edition of the Cross-Border Tax Talks podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates and may sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.